Over 85 million lives were lost and hundreds of millions more were wounded. Numbers beyond imagination, marking the greatest tragedy in human history. It was not merely a war, but a global nightmare, where humanity witnessed the very depths of pain, destruction, and loss. And perhaps just by hearing those numbers, you already know, we are talking about World War II. That war redrew the map of global politics and geopolitics, altered the course of history, and shaped the modern world we live in today. It was not just a conflict. It was the most brutal chapter in human history, where willpower, courage, and unimaginable suffering were forever engraved into our collective memory. Join Stories Before Sleep as we journey through the monumental events, fierce battles, and invaluable lessons of the Second World War in this powerful and compelling episode. After World War I, the map of Europe was redrawn, giving birth to a series of new nations from the collapse of great empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. At the Versailles Peace Conference and the Washington Conference, the victorious powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, reshaped the global balance of power and divided territories among themselves. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh and humiliating terms on Germany, plunging the nation into deep crisis and fueling a dangerous spirit of revenge and nationalism. Meanwhile, the victors themselves soon became entangled in conflicting interests. Britain and France sought to maintain their colonial empires, tightening control over Africa and the Middle East. The United States pursued a policy of open markets and free trade, opposing Europe's economic barriers. Japan grew resentful when its territorial ambitions in the Pacific and Asia were restricted by Britain and the US. And Italy, though among the victors, received none of the territories it desired in the Balkans and the Mediterranean, breeding deep frustration and discontent among its people. Those tensions made the peace that followed World War I dangerously fragile, a thin veneer covering the rising undercurrents of rivalry among the great powers. Then in 1929, the Great Depression erupted in the United States, spreading like a storm across the entire capitalist world. The crisis lasted nearly 4 years, bringing the global economy to its knees. Millions of workers lost their jobs, farmers lost their land, and societies plunged into chaos and unrest. Protests and riots broke out everywhere, especially in the major industrial nations. While Britain, France, and the United States sought to recover through economic and social reforms, Germany, Italy, and Japan looked for a way out by establishing fascist dictatorships and pursuing territorial expansion. In Germany, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, skillfully exploited the resentment of the people after World War I, spreading revenge-driven propaganda and extreme nationalism. After toppling the Weimar Republic, Hitler transformed Germany into a fascist state, rapidly militarizing the nation and turning it into a massive war machine. By 1938, Germany had built an army of 1.5 million soldiers, 30,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft, ready to launch its campaigns of conquest. At the same time, Italy, under Benito Mussolini, and Japan, under the control of its militarist generals, accelerated their own expansionist agendas. The three nations soon forged an alliance forming the Axis powers with a shared ambition to dominate the world. Japan began its aggression by invading Manchuria in 1931, then attacking China in 1937. Italy conquered Ethiopia in 1935, while Germany annexed Austria in 1938, and only months later seized the Sudetenland, the western border region of Czechoslovakia, home to many ethnic Germans. Facing this growing threat, the Soviet Union sought to form a united front with Britain and France to contain fascism. Yet despite fearing its rise, London and Paris were also deeply suspicious of communism. Instead of uniting, they adopted a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid conflict. effectively pushing the burden of war eastward toward the Soviet Union. That policy reached its peak with the Munich Agreement of 1938, when Britain and France allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland without consequence. This act emboldened Hitler's ambitions and exposed the weakness of the international security system. The combination of appeasement and conflicting interests among the great powers opened the door for World War II to erupt. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, a chain of military alliances was triggered, and a global conflict officially began. Earlier, in March 1938, Nazi Germany had annexed Austria in a bloodless takeover. Soon after, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans living there. He incited uprisings and separatist movements, demanding autonomy and creating an excuse for intervention. As the threat grew, the Soviet Union declared its readiness to support Czechoslovakia against Germany. However, Britain and France, still adhering to their policy of appeasement, pressured Czechoslovakia into surrendering. On September 29, 1938, at the Munich Conference, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy signed a disgraceful agreement, allowing Germany to occupy the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's empty promise to cease his aggression. But only a few months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his word, seizing all of Czechoslovakia. The German war machine was now unstoppable, and its next target was Poland. To avoid fighting on two fronts, Hitler negotiated with Stalin, and on August 23, 1939, the two nations signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Poland between them. At dawn on September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The German forces, over 1.5 million troops, 2,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, smashed through Polish defenses from multiple directions. The capital, Warsaw, was relentlessly bombed. Communication lines collapsed, and Polish units were cut off and unable to regroup. With their blitzkrieg, lightning war, tactics, the Germans crushed Poland's defenses in mere weeks. On September 17th, under the secret terms of the pact, the Soviet Red Army invaded from the east, trapping Polish forces between two massive fronts. By October 6th, Poland had fallen, over 200,000 soldiers were captured, and the nation was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Britain and France remained passive, deploying over 110 divisions along the French-German border, but taking no offensive action. This period became known as the Phony War, a time when war was declared, yet the guns remained silent. Germany, meanwhile, continued expanding its control over the Baltic region and invaded Finland in early 1940 to strengthen its northern position. Then on April 9, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark, with its small army, surrendered within hours, while Norway, aided by British forces, resisted fiercely, but eventually fell after 2 months. By securing strategic ports and iron supply routes from Sweden, Germany had laid the groundwork for even larger campaigns across Europe. In May 1940, Hitler unleashed a devastating blow on Western Europe. Within days, Nazi Germany swept through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, crushing every defensive line in its path. The Allied forces were forced to retreat to France's Maginot Line, a steel fortress once believed to be impregnable. But Hitler chose the path no one expected. He ordered his forces to advance through the Ardennes forest, a dense and rugged terrain the French thought was impossible for tanks to cross. From there, German troops struck deep into the rear lines, rendering the Maginot Line completely useless. On May 20, 1940, German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off the British and French armies at Dunkirk. Facing certain defeat, the British launched Operation Dynamo, evacuating 338,000 soldiers across the Channel under relentless German air raids. Despite fielding over 3 million troops, the British-French coalition was completely overwhelmed. In just 1 month, on June 22, 1940, France surrendered, leaving Britain alone to face the full might of the Nazi war machine. Germany occupied 3/4 of French territory, including Paris. Wasting no time, Hitler turned his sights on Britain, preparing for a two-pronged assault. At sea, a brutal battle of the Atlantic erupted between Germany's U-boats and the British Royal Navy. These wolf packs hunted down and sank thousands of Allied merchant ships, crippling Britain's food and supply lines. In the air, the Battle of Britain raged over the skies. The Royal Air Force, RAF, standing firm against the German Luftwaffe. Though Britain suffered heavy losses, its unyielding spirit and brilliant leadership forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw, marking Hitler's first major defeat of the war and a turning point that proved Britain would not fall easily. At sea, however, Germany still achieved some success. Thousands of Allied ships were sunk, severely straining the British economy. Yet even that was not enough to bring Britain to its knees. Hitler had failed to achieve his strategic goal of knocking Britain out of the war. In September 1940, to strengthen the Axis alliance, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. Under this agreement, if any of the three powers were attacked by a nation not yet at war, the others would provide full military and economic support. The pact effectively divided the world into two opposing spheres, Germany and Italy dominating Europe, while Japan controlled the Far East. Soon after, in October 1940, Germany shifted its focus to Eastern and Southern Europe, expanding its empire with ruthless efficiency. Romania and Hungary were turned into German puppet states and forced to join the Axis. German troops occupied key regions, securing vital resources, especially oil from Romania, the lifeblood of Hitler's vast war machine. In April 1941, after trying to remain neutral, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia suddenly faced a full-scale invasion by Nazi Germany. In just 11 days, the German army crushed Yugoslav resistance, a campaign so swift and destructive that few could even react. Not stopping there, Germany, with the support of Italy, launched an invasion of Greece. Despite British efforts to send reinforcements, by the summer of 1941, both Yugoslavia and Greece had fallen under Axis control. By mid-1941, Hitler had turned most of Europe into a chessboard under his command, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the deep forests of Eastern Europe. Many nations were annexed or reduced to puppet states, as his dream of building a 1,000-year Reich advanced at breathtaking speed. With Eastern and Southern Europe secured, rich in resources and strategic positions, the Soviet Union became Germany's next target. The plan, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was meticulously prepared. Hitler assembled an army on a scale never seen before, millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. Every element required for a total invasion was in place. The objective was clear: strike fast, destroy the Soviet Union within months using blitzkrieg tactics. A lightning war built on speed, surprise, and mechanized power. On June 27, 1941, Hitler shattered the Nazi-Soviet pact. Three massive army groups surged across the western border of the Soviet Union. The Northern Army Group advanced toward Leningrad, aiming to strangle the city's vital industrial and naval centers. The Central Army Group drove straight for Moscow, the heart of Soviet command. The Southern Army Group struck toward Kiev in Ukraine's fertile and industrial heartlands. The initial assault achieved staggering success. Intense battles, vast territories carved apart, and major cities under siege. But this was only the beginning of a brutal campaign, one where terrain, weather, the relentless Russian winter would soon test the limits of the German war machine and the unbreakable will of the Soviet people. In the early months of the invasion, German forces swept forward with unstoppable momentum, crushing many of the Red Army's defensive lines. Yet, unlike their swift victories in Western Europe, the Soviets fought with fierce determination. The brutal clashes came at a terrible cost to the Germans, who suffered heavy losses in men and equipment. By October 1941, Germany concentrated nearly all its strength on the Moscow front, hoping to capture the Soviet capital and end the war in the East. Hitler believed that if Moscow fell, the Soviet political and military structure would collapse, just as it had in Poland and France. But Stalin and the Soviet Defense Council refused to abandon the city, choosing instead to stay and command the defense directly. During two fierce assaults in October and November 1941, the Germans met stubborn resistance. When the harsh Russian winter arrived, the situation turned against them. Poorly equipped for freezing conditions, German troops began to falter, while the Red Army, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive. In December 1941, Soviet forces drove the Germans out of Moscow's outskirts, shattering Hitler's Blitzkrieg strategy and marking Germany's first major defeat on the Eastern Front. After the failure at Moscow, Hitler shifted his focus southward, toward the Soviet Union's vital resources, especially the oil fields of the Caucasus. The city of Stalingrad, perched on the banks of the Volga River, became the key objective for both sides. In August 1942, the Germans launched their offensive on Stalingrad, sparking one of the most intense and brutal urban battles in history, a fight that raged through every street and building. In November 1942, the Soviets struck back with Operation Uranus, encircling the entire German Sixth Army. By February 1943, the once mighty force of over 300,000 men was either killed or captured. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a decisive turning point, ending Germany's hope of victory on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Italy, under Mussolini, launched an attack on Egypt in September 1940, only to be driven back by British forces. To salvage the campaign, Hitler sent General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to assist. The Desert War dragged on for years, with both sides locked in a deadly stalemate, until October-November 1942, when the Allies under General Bernard Montgomery triumphed at the Battle of El Alamein. This decisive victory forced the Axis to retreat and paved the way for an Allied counteroffensive across North Africa. In Asia, Japan had long been preparing for imperial domination. As early as 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, setting up the puppet state of Manchukuo. Then in July 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, igniting the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal conflict that would merge into the wider chaos of World War II. In September 1940, Japan advanced into French Indochina, seizing control from Vichy France. The move drew strong condemnation from the United States, which responded by imposing an oil and trade embargo on Japan. As tensions escalated rapidly, Japan began preparing for a full-scale war. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In a lightning strike involving more than 350 aircraft, Japan inflicted devastating losses on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were sunk or heavily damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 servicemen killed. The attack brought America into the war overnight. On December 11, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, transforming the conflict into a truly global war. Riding on its initial success, Japan unleashed a wave of rapid offensives across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, targeting Western colonies. Within just 6 months, from December 1941 to June 1942, Japan expanded its empire at a staggering pace. Thailand quickly signed an agreement allowing Japanese forces to use its territory as a strategic base. Japanese troops invaded Malaya, broke through British defenses, and captured Singapore in February 1942, one of Britain's most humiliating defeats of the war. In the Philippines, after brutal battles at Bataan and Corregidor, the combined U.S.-Philippine forces surrendered in May 1942. In Burma, Myanmar, Japan swiftly seized control, pushing the Allies back to the Indian border. Japan also occupied Indonesia, seizing its vital oil and mineral resources to fuel its war machine. Across the Pacific, Japan captured key islands, including Wake, Guam, and the Solomon Islands, establishing a chain of heavily fortified naval bases. By 1942, Japan dominated an area of nearly 8 million square kilometers, ruling over 500 million people, stretching from East Asia through Southeast Asia to the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Empire had reached its zenith, but this very overreach would soon mark the beginning of its downfall. The brutality of the Axis powers galvanized nations across the world to unite under the Allied banner. A major turning point came when the Soviet Union officially entered the war in 1941, following Germany's invasion. The global balance of power shifted dramatically. At first, Britain and the United States were hesitant to ally with the Soviets, wary of their communist ideology. But faced with the common threat of fascism, the three powers forged an unprecedented alliance. It was a historic moment. Nations with opposing systems and visions joined together for one shared purpose: to destroy fascism and restore peace to the world. On January 1st, 1942, in Washington, D.C., the Allied powers formally united to create the Anti-Fascist Coalition. 26 nations, led by the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, signed the historic Declaration of the United Nations, pledging to use their full military, economic, and political strength to defeat the Axis powers, and vowing not to sign any separate peace agreements with the enemy. On the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Red Army faced Nazi Germany head-on, the war reached its most brutal stage. The Soviet Union's vast manpower and industrial capacity weakened Germany's might and restored hope to the Allied cause. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. Using a brilliant strategy of encirclement, the Red Army destroyed the entire German Sixth Army, 330,000 of Hitler's elite troops. This victory not only crippled Germany's power in the East, but also boosted Allied morale worldwide. After Stalingrad, Germany launched a massive counterattack at the Kursk salient, hoping to regain the initiative. The Soviets, anticipating the assault, repelled the offensive and annihilated over 30 German divisions, taking more than 500,000 enemy troops out of action. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, and it ended forever Germany's dream of a lightning war in the East. In early 1944, after 900 days under siege, Leningrad was finally liberated following a ferocious Soviet counterattack. It was the longest siege in modern warfare, a symbol of the extraordinary resilience of the Soviet people and army. The victory paved the way for the liberation of Soviet territory and the advance into Eastern Europe. By June 1944, the entire Soviet homeland was free, setting the stage for the Red Army's final offensives toward Germany. On the North African front, British and American forces, under General Bernard Montgomery, defeated General Erwin Rommel's German-Italian army, driving Axis forces out of North Africa. This strategic victory gave the Allies full control of the region and laid the groundwork for their invasion of Europe. In July 1943, Allied troops landed on the island of Sicily, quickly overcoming German and Italian defenses. The Mussolini regime collapsed, and a new Italian government surrendered to the Allies. However, Germany swiftly retaliated, rescuing Mussolini in September 1943 and establishing a puppet fascist regime in northern Italy. Over 30 German divisions were sent to block the Allied advance through the Apennine Mountains, turning Italy into a prolonged battlefield that would last until the end of the war. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, June 1942 saw the Battle of Midway, a decisive clash between the U.S. and Japanese navies. The U.S. Navy sank 4 of Japan's main aircraft carriers and destroyed hundreds of planes along with their most experienced pilots. The defeat at Midway crippled Japan's naval strength and ended its dominance in the Pacific. Soon after, U.S. forces launched their next major campaign at Guadalcanal, a strategically vital island. After months of fierce fighting, the Americans prevailed, and from there, they adopted the strategy of island hopping, seizing key islands one by one, isolating and neutralizing Japan's remaining strongholds across the Pacific. The United States and its allies launched massive counteroffensives, liberating key islands such as Guam, Saipan, and the Philippines, steadily shrinking Japan's vast empire in the Pacific. Though Japanese forces fought with unyielding determination, they grew increasingly exhausted and outmatched by America's overwhelming industrial and military power. In early 1944, the Soviet Red Army unleashed a series of major offensives across the Eastern Front. Like a storm, they swept the Germans and their allies from Soviet soil. By mid-year, the red flag of the USSR flew over much of Eastern Europe. As the Soviets liberated territory, they also extended their political influence throughout the region. By the end of the year, Soviet forces had reached the German border, preparing for the final assault. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. More than 156,000 troops, backed by the most powerful naval armada ever assembled, stormed the beaches of Normandy under a hail of German gunfire. Breaking through the coastal defenses, the Allies opened the gateway to occupied Europe. By August 1944, Paris was liberated, and Allied forces surged through Belgium and the Netherlands, closing in for the final showdown with Nazi Germany. At the Yalta Conference, the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met to shape the post-war world. They agreed on the division of Germany and Europe and outlined plans for reconstruction and peace. Stalin also pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan, setting the stage for the final battles in the Pacific. From January 1945, the Red Army pressed deep into Germany, striking at its very heart. The Battle of Berlin became one of the most brutal urban conflicts in history, where every street turned into a battlefield. On April 30, 1945, the Soviet flag rose over the Reichstag, symbolizing the collapse of Nazi Germany. Hitler, the man who had plunged the world into chaos, took his own life in his bunker. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but the bloodshed continued in the Pacific. From 1944 onward, Allied forces advanced island by island, fighting savage battles at Guam, Saipan, and Okinawa, where tens of thousands perished on both sides. The U.S. Navy closed in on the Japanese homeland, tightening the noose around Tokyo's ambitions. On August 6, 1945, a blinding flash of light illuminated the sky over Hiroshima. The world's first atomic bomb exploded, killing over 80,000 people instantly and reducing the city to ashes. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. More than 20,000 lives were lost in an instant. That same day, honoring the Yalta Agreement, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a lightning offensive against the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Japan's strongest military force. Within a week, the once mighty army was wiped out. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, and on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the formal surrender ceremony took place, officially bringing the darkest chapter in human history to an end. World War II concluded with the complete collapse of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Victory belonged to the nations that had endured unimaginable suffering to defeat fascism, led by the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, who would go on to reshape the global order. Yet the aftermath was staggering. More than 70 countries involving 1.7 billion people, nearly half of humanity at the time, had been drawn into the conflict. Over 60 million lives were lost, 90 million were wounded, and entire cities and industries lay in ruins. The scars left by the war were not only physical, but deeply human. Wounds of grief, loss, and trauma that would haunt generations to come. But instead of achieving lasting peace, the world stepped into a new era of profound transformation. A bipolar order emerged, with the Soviet Union and the United States leading two opposing camps, socialism and capitalism. Ideological tensions soon divided the world, creating deep political and social rifts among nations. In 1945, the United Nations was born, carrying the hope of preserving global peace and stability. Yet it quickly faced challenges, often from the very superpowers that helped create it. Almost immediately after the war, the two great wartime allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, turned from cooperation to confrontation. Thus began the Cold War, a conflict without gunfire, but filled with intense rivalry, shaping global politics for the next half-century. It was a battle of ideologies, a struggle for influence and power, fought not on battlefields but through espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars that spanned the globe. World War II was not only a victory of freedom over tyranny, but also a bitter reminder of the terrible cost of war. The sacrifices of millions laid the foundation for humanity's enduring desire for peace, even as they revealed the deep fractures in the world order. The war may have ended, but its echoes still resonate today. It reshaped the political map, altered the fate of entire nations, and left behind lessons that must never be forgotten. Lessons about the value of peace, the strength of the human spirit, and the devastating price of conflict. From the ashes of destruction, humanity rose again, rebuilding, striving for prosperity, yet constantly facing new divisions and challenges. The line between peace and catastrophe remains as fragile as ever. If you believe that history is not just to be remembered, but to awaken us, then join us as we continue to uncover the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next journeys as we explore the hidden truths and timeless lessons of human history.